Take one.
No vice president ever has the opportunity to become properly prepared to become president and succeed to that great office. Every president, when he goes into office, takes some time to familiarize himself with the duties. John Marshall said there was only one heartbeat between the vice president and the White House, and he knew exactly what he was talking about, and I experienced that situation. But when the vice president does take over, he must assume the office of the presidency and do the very best he can to make it work. And most of the vice presidents who have been forced to take over that office have done a good job. I don't want to include myself in that because I was a president myself after that.
Cut.
At 7:09 p.m. on April 12, 1945, Harry S. Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. Just 82 days after assuming the role of Vice President, his predecessor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had dominated the political landscape for the previous 12 years. FDR's death came as a shock to an already traumatized nation who had come to view the man from Hyde Park as a kind of father figure, one who guided them through the Great Depression and a war against the global threat of fascism, a war that many Americans hadn't even wanted to enter in the first place. The unexpected president's first few weeks in office were some of the most tumultuous in American history. As Nazi armies reeled from one Allied blow after the other, fascism in Europe began to crumble. Before the end of April, Axis leaders Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler were both dead, and on May 8th, the Allies declared victory in Europe. The celebrations were short-lived, however, as the country continued to face mounting casualties in the Pacific.
I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
You're listening to the best of my ability from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. I'm your host, Dr. Kristen Burton. This is episode 1, It's All Over. Our story begins on Truman's first full day in office.
What do you say? He's drinking from a fire hose on that first day.
That's Dr. Rob Citino, Samuel Z. Murray Stone's senior historian and executive director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum.
The meetings come fast and furious. On April 12th, President Roosevelt dies, and on April 13th, the Secretary of State comes into his office, that's Edward Stettinius, and hands him, the briefing paper. And it's a mess. The Germans seem to be on their last legs, but who knows? And there's already a social chaos is breaking out in parts of occupied Europe. Food is in short supply. If the social order breaks down in any of our new conquered territories, we could be looking at a World War III right around the corner. This is before lunch on his first full day in the White House. But I think we could also say from the perspective of those who just walked into the Oval Office, so perhaps this man isn't quite the commanding presence that Franklin Roosevelt was, but he was a quick study. He took in information very, very rapidly. He shot back almost always very, very perceptive questions. He told you when the meeting was over. So, in other words, I think there is maybe a bit of conscious role-playing on Truman's part in these first couple of days in office, that he knows the old cliche, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, and that the first impression he's going to make on these men is going to be extremely important.
Truman, the son of a farmer and livestock dealer, came from humble origins, a sharp contrast to his wealthy and well-traveled predecessor, FDR. Born in the small town of Lamar, Missouri, Truman's family moved to Independence when he was 6 years old. Located on the cusp of the West and the South, Independence was home to just 6,000 residents, and much like the Jim Crow South, black and white residents were segregated into separate parts of town. Young Truman experienced a turbulent adolescence. His family struggled financially. He had difficulty fitting in at school. He survived a near-deadly childhood bout of diphtheria, and his ambitions of attending West Point were crushed because of his poor eyesight. Truman's first exposure to politics was as a high school student, working as a page for the 1900 Democratic National Convention. a position he secured through his father's friend, who was a local leader in the Democratic Party. The choice of Kansas City for the convention had been met with jokes from cartoonists and reporters, which depicted the city as old-fashioned and outdated, with a Wild West mentality. In taking office, Truman became the only president since William McKinley who had not earned a college degree. Though he had attended Spalding's Commercial College, a business school in Kansas City. He was enrolled for a year before leaving to help his father try to resuscitate the failing family business. He also assumed the presidency with just $4,200 in the bank account he shared with his wife Bess. And he owed $3,000 in debt to the Hamilton National Bank of Washington. The difficulties he faced as a young man and throughout his life would follow Truman for much of his political career, and it greatly influenced the way he thought about himself and how others viewed him.
He suspects they look at him and see some kind of bumpkin. I think that's somewhere in the back of his mind. And I think any notion they may have had in that direction is probably dispelled after 2 or 3 days. He went home, at night and does things like stare at the occupation zones of Germany in the maps that have been drawn up and looks at the various terms that are being demanded and thinks about reparations. And he can handle numbers with a piece of paper and a pencil, but he can also handle them in his head. And I think that helps him then come in the next day and impress the next gang even more so. He did a take on virtually everybody. He said, Stimson is a sharp character, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. He said, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, he said was a blockhead. He also asked Morgenthau to stay on, but there was something, maybe some personality issues there that the two didn't get along. So he's not above making his own snap judgments, just as, he's aware that they're probably doing that to him.
Truman also experienced a rocky start in his relationships with the other Allied leaders, never quite replacing Roosevelt in the Big Three triumvirate that also included Prime Minister of the UK Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. While Churchill supported him early on in his presidency, the two never fully shared the same special relationship that Churchill and Roosevelt had cultivated.
Churchill had a very warm personal relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, deliberately cultivated. As British power waned in the course of the war and U.S. power grew, it was clear that the British were becoming a second-rate power, at least compared to the United States. They were the junior member of a three-member coalition. So being Franklin Roosevelt's personal friend was value-added to Great Britain, and Churchill knew that, but he was never really able to establish the same kind of warm relationship with Truman that he had with Roosevelt. He and Roosevelt, Churchill and Roosevelt, that is, were both members of the old aristocracy. They enjoyed fine wines and cognacs and all the things that you would associate with that kind of lifestyle, and that's not Truman. But let us also keep in mind that Truman comes into office in April. And within a couple of months, Churchill is going to be voted out of office. And so the personal relationship between Churchill and Truman is somewhat less important than the personal relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt.
As for Stalin, Truman took a harder line than FDR had with the Soviet leader. While the war in Europe was now solidly in the favor of the Allies, Stalin had left a string of broken promises in the months after the February Yalta Conference. At the conference, the Soviets had promised that they would allow the recently liberated Poland to hold free elections so that the nation could enact its own democratic government. What occurred instead was the establishment of a puppet regime under Stalin's control. It was becoming clear to Roosevelt and his administration that in addition to Poland, Stalin was attempting to gain full control over Eastern Europe, including Hungary and Romania. Stalin refused to compromise, believing that Roosevelt had betrayed him, and was trying to negotiate a Nazi surrender without Soviet involvement. While the tension ultimately eased, the rift revealed the roots of what would lead to the Cold War some years later. While Truman didn't meet Stalin himself until 2 months into his presidency, his early conversations with Stalin's number 2, V.M. Molotov, didn't make him any friends.
Now, the other big fella here in the coalition is Joseph Stalin. And Truman makes a very, very rough impression on Stalin. Not personally. He does it through Stalin's foreign minister, V.I. Molotov. Molotov was the foreign minister. That is in charge of foreign affairs, but was also kind of a deputy Stalin. He was seen as the number 2 guy and Stalin's closest advisor. And on April 21st, Molotov's in the White House because Truman, who has been in office all of 8 days, is already getting nervous about the Soviets apparently violating some of the things they promised to do at the Yalta Conference, which was held in the previous month, late February and March, in terms of holding free elections and allowing democratic systems of government to be established in their occupied territories. And he's already said in the presence of his aides, if the Soviets don't start behaving, they can go to hell. Now, he didn't tell Molotov that when Molotov came to the White House. But he did lecture Molotov up and down about failing to live up to the promises that you've made at Yalta. And when Molotov, who, let's face it, has blood on his hands, he's Stalin's second in command, he said, I am not used to being spoken to in this manner. And Truman shot back, well, keep your commitments and then nobody will speak to you in this manner. And then more or less said, that's it, the meeting's over.
Above all else, winning the war consumed Truman's every waking moment. While there was optimism in the administration that an Allied victory was forthcoming, news of Roosevelt's death reportedly elicited glee from Adolf Hitler. According to Nazi Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, as documented in Speer's memoirs, Hitler believed Roosevelt's passing meant the tides may turn and the war wasn't inevitably lost for the Axis powers. Truman understood that in order to continue on a trajectory of victory and save as many American lives as possible, the Allies needed to hold their coalition together at all costs.
Well, there is still a war on, and his Joint Chiefs of Staff have just come into his office and told him that the war might be on a lot longer yet. There's some optimistic reports coming from the fronts, particularly in Europe, where the Germans, remember, we're talking about mid-April. Hitler has a couple weeks to live before he shoots himself, and the German army will collapse altogether. So we're talking about a couple weeks out from the collapse. Now, no one knows that at the time. We have to remember that people at the time, we have all the benefit of hindsight. But there are optimistic reports coming back from the front. But he also has reports now from his Joint Chiefs of Staff who say, it could take 6 months, maybe longer. You know, that's another 300,000 casualties if you're sort of prorating casualties in 1945. That's not good news. And as to the Japanese, well, they might be in the field another 18 months, another year and a half. And that too, you know, time is casualties in modern war, and it certainly was in World War II. So that's Truman's big worry, and it had to be, winning the war. It seemed like we were on the edge and on the verge, and all the signs looked positive, but winning the war. And so what does that further mean is you have to hold the coalition together. He's already given Molotov a pretty good tongue lashing, but he also wants honesty between the partners. There are peace feelers coming out of Germany that are being directed to Churchill, and Churchill has passed them on to Truman, but Truman wants nothing to do with them unless they talk to Stalin first. That's all that they need, right, is to have the Western allies accept a German surrender while the Soviets are left in the lurch, given the fact that the Soviets have done all the fighting.
As a war veteran himself, Truman also understood the demoralizing impact that losing the commander-in-chief in a time of war can have on those fighting. In the days following Roosevelt's death, Truman was determined to speak directly to the armed forces.
Good evening from the White House in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
To the armed forces of the United States throughout the world. After the tragic news of the death of our late Commander-in-Chief, it was my duty to speak promptly to the Congress and the armed forces of the United States. Yesterday, I addressed the Congress. Now, I speak to you. I am especially anxious to talk to you, for I know that all of you felt a tremendous shock, as we did at home, when our Commander-in-Chief fell. All of us have lost a great leader, a far-sighted statesman, and a real friend of democracy. We have lost a hard-hitting chief and an old friend of the services. Our hearts are heavy. However, the cause which claimed Roosevelt also claims us. He never faltered, nor will we. I have done as you do in the field when the commander-in-chief falls. My duties and responsibilities are clear. I have assumed them. These duties will be carried on in keeping with our American tradition. As a veteran of the First World War, I have seen death on the battlefield. When I fought in France with the 35th Division, I saw good officers and men fall and be replaced. I know that this is also true of the officers and men of the other services, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and the Merchant Marine. I know the strain, the mud, the misery, the utter weariness of the soldier in the field. And I know, too, his courage, his stamina, his faith in his comrades, his country, and himself. We are depending upon each and every one of you.
Across Europe, Allied forces continued to liberate regions that were under Nazi rule. Although the Allies were winning the fight, the true extent of the death and destruction was coming to light, and the brutality was taking a toll on the troops. The scenes that the 89th Division discovered at Ohrdruf, the first concentration camp liberated by the United States Army, were so horrific that reports led General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, to visit the camp with Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. The visit had a powerful impact on Eisenhower, who became determined to make these atrocities public to the world. He received permission from Truman and Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson to bring both journalists and members of Congress to the camp so they could broadcast what had been done to the Hungarian Jews, Poles, Russians, and others who had been imprisoned there. It was clearer than ever what was at stake if the Allies lost. For Truman and his cabinet, it also became obvious that Stalin had not given up on his quest to control Eastern Europe. But in order to ensure defeat against the Axis, the United States had to continue to work with the Soviets, who were closing in on Berlin in the final days of April.
The German army by April of 1945 was somewhere just south of freefall. I'm not sure exactly what to call it. There'd been a gigantic battle of encirclement of most of the German fighting forces in the district known as the Ruhr, which was the big industrial heartland. We used to say the Pittsburgh of Germany at the time. And some 200,000 or 300,000 German soldiers had marched off into Allied, largely American captivity. In fact, so many that you could not even build camps for them all. They were left out in open air encampments, so-called Rhine Meadow camps, as they were sometimes called, at the mercy of the elements. It's not really a great situation, but not much could have been done about it at the time. The German commander, Field Marshal Walter Model, shot himself somewhere inside that encirclement, and so there's the real collapse of the German army. There was a joke in Germany at the time, this isn't really bad. You can now walk from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. It's a kilometer between the two big armies coming in. So who knows? Who knew at the time exactly when the war would end? But the military signs were all positive. There was fear that Hitler and his cronies would somehow spirit themselves off into the Alps somewhere, a so-called Alpenfestung or Alpine redoubt, where they would lead some kind of last-ditch resistance surrounded by hardcore members of the SS. There was fear about that, real fear. And that was one of the reasons that it was so important for the Americans and Soviets to meet at Torgau, to prevent Hitler from doing that.
We are interrupting our programs to bring you a news flash.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
The death of Adolf Hitler, along with the brutal and public execution of his Italian counterpart Benito Mussolini just 2 days earlier, made the end of the war in Europe a certainty. All the while, Allied troops continued to liberate those who had been held captive under these fascist regimes. The news was slow to spread to the United States. In a news conference days after Hitler's suicide, Truman answered questions from reporters with brief but pointed answers. When asked if he would care to comment on the reports that Hitler and Mussolini were dead, he responded, quote, "Two principal war criminals will not have to come to trial, and I am very happy they are out of the way." The reporter followed up asking, quote, "Does that mean, sir, that we know officially that Hitler is dead?" The president replied, "Yes." 6 days later, President Truman would announce that the war in Europe was over.
This is a solemn but a glorious hour. I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity. Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. Let us not forget, my fellow Americans, the sorrow and the heartache which today abide in the homes of so many of our neighbors. Neighbors whose most priceless possession has been rendered as a sacrifice to redeem our liberty.
In our next episode, Death Stand, we will hear more from Dr. Rob Citino as we delve into the war that continued to rage in the Pacific. On Okinawa, tens of thousands of American troops had landed just 10 days before Truman took office, finding themselves in what would become one of the most furious and costly battles of the 20th century. While the war in Europe was over, there was still a long road ahead. From the National World War II Museum, I'm Dr. Kristen Burton. This episode was written by our executive producer, Gemma R. Birnbaum. Media production manager Jeremy Burson did the sound mixing. Archival audio is courtesy of the National Archives, the Screen Gems collection at the Harry S. Truman Library, and the BBC. If you like this podcast, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, which helps others to find the series. To the Best of My Ability is part of an ongoing series of programs commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, made possible by the Nierenberg family and Bank of America.